Good afternoon. All right, good afternoon and welcome to the Eisenhower Presidential Library and Museum. Thank you for joining us for our September Lunch and Learn. Before we begin, I want to introduce and welcome our new director, Dr. Todd Emeritus.
Good afternoon. Thanks very much for coming today. It's great to see such a great turnout. I hear this is a really good turnout, and I can only assume it's because you knew I was going to be here. So thank you all for coming. I'm really looking forward to this program and looking forward to getting to see and know all of you in the years ahead. Very happy to be here. Thanks very much for coming today.
Now, as you know, our 2024 annual theme is Waging Peace. This year, we looked at the many different ways that President Eisenhower worked towards a global peace. This month is dedicated to studying President Eisenhower's farewell address. So today we are pleased to welcome Dr. Benjamin Greene with the U.S. State Department to reconsider Ike's farewell address. So Dr. Greene, welcome and thank you for joining us.
Thank you so much, Joy. It's an honor to be here. I'm grateful for the Eisenhower Foundation and the Jeffcoat Memorial Foundation for really making this series possible, and particularly thrilled to be speaking about waging peace and reconsidering Eisenhower's farewell address here. As a civil servant, of course, I'm speaking to you on behalf of my public private capacity as a historian rather than as a government spokesperson. So I have this disclaimer on my slide that the views expressed in these remarks are my own and not necessarily those of the U.S. Department of State or the United States government. And I'd also like to note that all the sources that I mentioned are publicly available, declassified, many of them available online through the document collection through the Eisenhower Library Museum, as well as the U.S. Department of State's Foreign Relations of the U.S. series. So a little bit about my background and how I came to be interested in this topic. Before I joined the State Department about a year ago, I had taught history at Bowling Green State University in Northwest Ohio for 10 years. Prior to that, I had served 22 years in the U.S. Army, including 8 years abroad, most recently in Afghanistan. And I also had the opportunity during that career to teach history of foreign relations at the U.S. Military Academy at West Point and the U.S. Naval Academy in Annapolis, Maryland. But I think most importantly, like Eisenhower, I'm a product of the plains. I spent my professional career serving across the country and around the world, but I grew up 2 hours north of Abilene, just north on Highway 77, in that city that was home to K-State's then Big 8 rival, and is also the hometown of William Jennings Bryan, who will have a cameo appearance in our discussion today. So one of the great joys of being an Eisenhowerist is the opportunity to conduct research in Abilene and really to be closer to home and my roots than any of my various government assignments across the years have afforded me. So as I join you remotely today to reconsider Eisenhower's farewell address, it's entirely appropriate that we discuss this speech as those in the live audience are enjoying lunch during the Lunch and Learn program, because the archival record is fortunately rich with some food metaphors. And so we'll learn, for example, how the response to Eisenhower's speech took on a curiously yeasty quality, and that it provided red meat to gleefully gnaw upon for the next several decades. So keep those food metaphors in mind as you are enjoying your sandwiches at lunch today. So what I would like to do is really focus on three aspects of Eisenhower's speech. Of course, his warning about the unwarranted influence of a military-industrial complex. But second, an additional warning that has really been overshadowed by the first, and that's the warning that public policy could become captive of a scientific technological elite. The third theme is Eisenhower's expression of a definite sense of disappointment at his administration's lack of progress on disarmament. So what I'll then like to do is tie these last two aspects together to suggest that these two less commented upon aspects of his farewell address, indicate first his disappointment at his inability to achieve his final effort at waging peace, and that is reaching a nuclear arms control agreement. And that second, his warning about public policy becoming captive of a scientific technological elite expresses his bitterness at the forces, the scientific technological elite within his own administration, that he believed frustrated his efforts at waging peace. So let's begin by considering how unexpected it really is that many Americans now associate Eisenhower's presidency with his farewell address. So if we can bring up his quote on the military-industrial complex. After all, Eisenhower is certainly not known as one of the most gifted orators to occupy the Oval Office. During his presidency, the press commented more upon his garbled syntax, his semantic wanderings in press conferences that often confused more than clarified his intentions. Now, historians have since identified much of this as purposeful evasions, part of what Fred Greenstein would call his hidden hand presidency, a hidden hand leadership, that used these evasions and semantic wanderings to really avoid talking about contentious issues so that he would maintain his popularity. That being ambiguous would allow him to maintain his flexibility and perhaps even bolster the power of some of his bluffs amidst some of these foreign policy crises. It's also interesting that his farewell address received little immediate commentary. And we can see this in a letter from one of his speechwriters, Ralph Williams. We can put this slide up here. This is in 1985. Ralph Williams, one of the speechwriters, wrote that he was astonished at the attention that has been given to the military-industrial complex portion of his speech. And he agreed that its true significance has been distorted beyond recognition. In Williams' view, the warning against the military-industrial complex had become red meat for the media, who have gleefully gnawed on it for 25 years. And so this just illustrates the various attention that has been played to this warning and how it's been interpreted in various ways over the years. And it's even more curious how much attention this speech has garnered historically, because in the immediate aftermath of the speech, it drew very little commentary. Eisenhower held his final press conference as president the morning after he delivered the speech to a nationwide TV and radio audience. And of the many questions that he fielded that day, only 2 were related to his farewell address comments. And of those 2, neither of them asked about the military-industrial complex. So this lack of attention initially, if we think about the context and the public mood of January 1961, is actually not too surprising. At the time, it was the end of Eisenhower's 8-year presidency. The press and the public had really shifted their attention then away from Eisenhower, the old warhorse, to a youthful and charismatic incoming president, John F. Kennedy. So very little commentary initially after the speech. But things began to change a few months later. As our next slide shows, a few politicians and publications began to return to this idea. And one of the letters held at the archives there, and also part of their online exhibit that you see a link to on the screen, is from Eisenhower's former aide, Bryce Harlow. And he's writing a letter just commenting on several things to former President Eisenhower and former Vice President Nixon. But in this letter, he says that Eisenhower's warning about the military-industrial complex turns out to be curiously yeasty. I love that word, curiously yeasty. In this usage, I think Harlow is really referring to yeasty as being marked by change and full of vitality. So very, very apt terms used already just a couple of months after the speech. So curiously yeasty indeed. To mix the usage here, the concept of a military-industrial complex really has slowly risen at various points over the past 60 plus years, often taking new forms and drawing diverse meanings, and really emerging from vastly different points across the political spectrum. So if we consider briefly the evolution of this term and how it's been used by very diverse voices. Early on in October of 1961, the liberal periodical The Nation devoted its entire issue to examining the growth of what it termed the warfare state. And a few years later, as America's war in Vietnam expanded, the anti-war movement often blamed the military-industrial complex for the expansion and the continuance of the war. Later in the 1960s, some politicians would take on additional meanings for the term. Wisconsin Senator William Proxmire, who had taken Joseph McCarthy's old district, cited the example of the military-industrial complex as part of his hearings in Congress about wasteful and fraudulent defense spending. And so journalists and politicians were soon to be joined by Hollywood, with Hollywood providing its own take on the meaning of this. Oliver Stone ran Eisenhower's warning, footage of Eisenhower's warning at the start of his 1991 film JFK, which suggested that a conspiracy of the military-industrial complex orchestrated the assassination of President Kennedy due to fears that he would pull out of Vietnam and make peace with the Soviet Union. And less than 15 years later, another Hollywood film, this is the documentary Why We Fight, that won a grand jury prize at the 2005 Sundance Film Festival. Why We Fight also features Eisenhower's military-industrial complex portion of his farewell address, this time to blame it not just on the war in Vietnam, but in a much longer-term persistent period of excessive defense spending and conflict that the nation had embarked upon since the Second World War. So if we think about all of these collectively, we have anti-war liberals, we have fiscal conservatives, we have conspiracy theorists, just a few of the many strange bedfellows who have cited Eisenhower's warning to advance various causes over the last 60 years. And so it raises some really interesting questions about what to make of this warning when so many different people across the political spectrum have continued to raise it in different contexts and for different purposes. And so if we consider why this is, why don't we have a definitive answer as to precisely what Eisenhower meant, or even how he defined the term? If we go back and look at the record, it's really quite mixed. And even though we have lots of comment, they oftentimes are vague and ambiguous. So if I were to break down several different strands of evidence and really mention what they tell us and what they don't tell us, it's certainly unclear. The specific term military-industrial complex doesn't appear before this speech, either in his public remarks or in his private remarks. For the speech itself, there's several drafts that the Eisenhower Library has many different iterations of them. Contains the term, but there's very few markings in the margins that suggest broader intent behind them. Eisenhower himself really avoided making any public comment on his intent behind the speech. When he was asked in his press conference the day after the speech what he meant by the scientific technological elite, he simply said he meant nothing more than what he said the night before. And so a very frustrating answer for those who are curious what he was specifically referring to. The online document collection has a few letters that Eisenhower had replied to those in the mid-60s asking for him to comment more clearly upon the military-industrial complex and what he meant by that. His answers are pretty brief and offer very few clues. If we then move through the historical record into the later 60s and the 1980s, Eisenhower's speechwriters, Malcolm Moose and Ralph Williams, each provided oral histories and have their records deposited in the library. But they're really inconclusive as to what they're arguing. And in some ways, they have an ongoing battle amongst themselves of who is more central in writing the speech overall. Of course, Eisenhower had his memoirs, his 2-volume memoir collection. The second volume, Waging Peace, appropriately enough, reprints the entire section of the speech related to the military-industrial complex. But as he often did in public, he often let those words stand for themselves without much elaboration. In the case of his memoirs, he does identify three main sectors that he thought comprised the military-industrial complex that advocated for unjustified peacetime military spending. And so the first part was the branches of the military. The second part of this was the defense industry and their lobbyists. And the third were members of Congress who were from districts that held military installations or manufacturing plants, and that they were seeking continued defense spending to bolster the economies of their districts. So collectively, all of these things are inconclusive about what precisely he meant. And so I think in many ways, we have to broaden our view of what evidence we are seeking, what evidence we are examining to understand perhaps what he meant. And so I would suggest that our best clues lie not so much in the speech itself, in his memoir comments about the speech, or in specific reflections of others on the speech, but rather how Eisenhower talked about these events outside of the context of preparing for a speech, and how he periodically raised these concerns in secret deliberations of the National Security Council and other meetings. And in doing this, historians are incredibly fortunate to have the meticulously recorded memoranda of conversations from those such as Andrew Goodpaster or John S.D. Eisenhower and others that are really unique in presidential records. The Goodpaster and Eisenhower memoranda appear to record the very precise wording, including all of the banter, all of the thinking out loud, the pungent words and comments. And the records of the Eisenhower administration are very rare in this regard. For the administrations that followed, oftentimes that suffered through leaks, constitutional controversies and scandals ranging from the release of the Pentagon Papers to Watergate and Iran-Contra, some administrations only archived and retained very concise and dry summaries and conclusions of discussions, rather than the verbatim discussions themselves that captured the spirited arguments, the sharp language, and the ebb and flow of discussions about policy deliberations. So the Eisenhower Library and those who study the Eisenhower presidency are really fortunate to have those types of records that are increasingly unique amongst presidential historians to try to find out the policy deliberations here. So what we can learn from these comments and from the memoranda of meetings of the National Security Council that were held on a regular basis during the administration, I think there's several insights that we can draw that illustrated some of Eisenhower's concerns here. And a lot of it is the frustrations that he had based upon his stature, his unrivaled stature as the wartime Supreme Commander of Allied forces in Western Europe, and then as NATO's first commander. He constantly drew upon his gravitas in the military community to downplay near hysterical calls from the DoD and members of Congress and defense establishments and think tanks that really were clamoring for an additional defense spending. And in particular episodes really heightened these calls. Certainly the Soviet launch of Sputnik in 1957, the Gaither Committee that was commissioned to examine possible vulnerabilities of the United States to Soviet surprise attack went beyond their mandate on that particular issue to very publicly leak recommendations for a massive increase in defense spending. And then, of course, there were charges from Kennedy and other Democrats in the 1960 presidential campaign. First, that Eisenhower had allowed a bomber gap to exist, and later that a missile gap was allowed to exist. And it's very clear from the private conversations that Eisenhower did not think highly at all of John F. Kennedy. He did not think that Kennedy possessed the military experience, despite his wartime service in the Pacific, that Kennedy lacked the military experience or certainly the stature in rank, and also the stamina and character to really be able to ward off these pressures from the top brass within the military community and to call for more defense spending. Eisenhower, of course, was a fiscal conservative, and he held a long-time concern that what he would characterize as excessive peacetime spending would lead to a government-managed garrison state. Garrison state was the term that you see frequently in the archives. A term that he was concerned that this would lead the United States to lead to price controls and to really hurt the wartime economy and erode America's democratic values here. And so you can see his concerns about the societal cost of this, of course, in his Chance for Peace speech in 1953, that I think remains one of the most eloquent expressions of the societal costs of diverting military spending from food, from housing, from education, just to pay for armaments. And it's clear that this is drawing upon some other concerns and strands of thoughts from the era in the 1930s. Eisenhower and his advisors, his speechwriters, were certainly aware of the congressional investigations in the 1930s of the Nye Committee. Those that investigated the arms merchants, called at the time the merchants of death, who had conspired to pull the nation into the First World War. Okay? So this was a strong strand of thought. And it's always a remarkable figure to be reminded that in a Gallup poll in the mid-1930s, over 70% of Americans thought that America's involvement in World War I was a mistake. And so it's always incredible to view that level of attitudes toward the First World War, and how in the midst of the Great Depression, looking for scapegoats, oftentimes it went to corporate America and went back into corporate profiteering during the First World War. So these concerns were prominent in the 1930s and continue to be channeled into the 1950s. Eisenhower also expressed on many occasions concerns with what has been called the revolving door. That's the practice of senior generals and admirals who retire from the military and then start to work the next day with leading defense manufacturers and become corporate lobbyists. That was a concern certainly the speechwriters were aware of and Eisenhower commented upon. And also on several separate occasions, unprovoked, he commented upon how much of an impact it would take on the morale and the psyche of America to see full-page advertisements from military contractors for more armaments peppered throughout some of the leading periodicals of the time. So if you consider all of these things, these various strands and concerns and debate back and forth, you can see that biographers, policy analysts, and others have each cited these various aspects that I've raised to speculate on what Eisenhower's greatest concerns were about the military-industrial complex. So the historical record certainly provides numerous plausible explanations and gives examples of things that had animated his concerns in the past, but it's hard to then link those to his specific comments in his farewell address. So certainly Eisenhower had some concerns, but we don't have any satisfactory answers here. And I think a little bit of this goes to the fact that Eisenhower is somewhat conflicted in his own mind about what the answer is or what the remedy is. Consider that he asserted in his speech that only an alert and knowledgeable citizenry can compel the proper meshing of the huge industrial and military machinery of defense with our peaceful methods and goals, so that security and liberty may prosper together. Okay, so what Eisenhower is saying that the best guard against the unwarranted influence of the military-industrial complex is an alert and knowledgeable citizenry. Yet, in this time of the nuclear age, the citizens could not be alert and knowledgeable about the full scope of Soviet military capabilities. The imperatives of secrecy on matters such as U-2 flights and the new technology of satellite imagery meant that only a few Americans at the very highest levels of government had the knowledge about enemy capabilities to determine what levels of defense spending was sufficient. So there's some inherent tension in the problem that Eisenhower sees and the solution that he offers that makes interpreting his true meaning problematic. So that's much on Eisenhower's first warning of the military-industrial complex, but these were always paired as twin warnings. And in the drafts of the speech, these two are always attached together. And so it's kind of interesting historically that the military-industrial complex warning has taken off, and history has largely forgotten that it was followed by a second warning. Okay, so let's have a slide, thank you, of the second warning here. Eisenhower warned that public policy could become the captive of what he called a scientific technological elite. Well, once again, this is a difficult thing to interpret. What public policy was he talking about? And who were the elites that were part of the scientific technological elite? And so I think there are as many interpretive challenges with this warning as there are the first. Historians assessing Eisenhower's legacy in arms control have understandably been confounded by the inconsistencies in Eisenhower's public words and his policy decisions. Of course, Eisenhower spoke passionately about his desire to slow the nuclear arms race, as his Chance for Peace speech indicates at the start of his term. And he commented at the end of his farewell address, disarmament with mutual honor and confidence is a continuing imperative. Because this need is so sharp and apparent, I confess that I lay down my official responsibilities in this field with a definite sense of disappointment. He goes on and says, as one who has witnessed the horror and the lingering sadness of war, as one who knows that another war could utterly destroy this civilization which has been so slowly and painfully built over thousands of years, I wish I could say tonight that a lasting peace is in sight. So here again, drawing upon some themes from his Chance for Peace speech, remains, I think, one of the most powerful indictments of the economic, social, and psychological costs of the arms war. We have Eisenhower really eloquently speaking about his interest in disarmament. But on the other hand, if you look at what his national security policy did, it led to an increase in the nation's nuclear arsenal from about 1,400 nuclear warheads to over 20,000 nuclear warheads during his presidency. Of course, his New Look strategy that sought to contain the expansion of communism through threats of massive retaliations from the nation's nuclear arsenal shows his reliance upon nuclear weapons. And so these actions, the acceleration of the nuclear arms race and the reliance upon them, have led some historians to conclude that Eisenhower was really never seriously considering pursuing nuclear arms control agreements. In their view, some of his earlier initiatives, such as Atoms for Peace and his Open Skies proposals, were merely hollow exercises in Cold War propaganda designed to counter Soviet moves and to put them in a position where they had to deny things that were clearly propaganda. So we have these very completing and conflicting aspects of Eisenhower's legacy that I think really leave us with two enduring questions. Did Eisenhower genuinely seek progress towards waging peace and disarmament through a ban on nuclear testing? And if he was serious, then why did he fail to reach an agreement? So what I found in research at the Eisenhower Library and in the papers of many of his advisors at various other presidential libraries is a remarkable consistency in Eisenhower's public statements and in his private remarks. His diary and his private letters often dwell on his fears that the costs of waging a Cold War for an indefinite period could drive the nation to a garrison state or to some form of dictatorship. And the records of secret meetings reveal his inclination to seek a ban on nuclear testing to slow the arms race, and to serve as an important first step towards building mutual confidence for disarmament. So there's consistencies in the public and the private comments that really answers the first question, I think definitively, that Eisen was in fact sincere about seeking an arms control agreement. But that then leads us to the second question. If he was sincere, then why did he fail? And why did he not move more decisively to avoid what he felt compelled to express in his farewell address, that he was disappointed at the lack of progress toward disarmament? So I'd like to suggest that it was a powerful scientific technological elite within his administration that succeeded in blocking his pursuit of a test ban for much of his presidency. Well, now, of course, we need to try to break this down a little bit and figure out what this scientific technological elite is or was. And so from here, we can draw upon perhaps a recent film that some of you have seen, which is Oppenheimer, the winner of 7 Oscars, including Best Picture. And you may be familiar with a couple of the same antagonists from that film that are central to this discussion today. And that's Lewis Strauss and Edward Teller. So we have a slide of Lewis Strauss here, chairman of the Atomic Energy Commission with President Eisenhower. In the film Oppenheimer, Robert Downey Jr. Played Strauss. Robert Downey Jr. won the Best Supporting Actor award for his portrayal of Strauss. Strauss was the principal antagonist in the film as the instigator of the loyalty security hearing of J. Robert Oppenheimer. Strauss was a cold warrior, utterly convinced that the nation's survival depended upon its ability to maintain its nuclear superiority through continuous testing of nuclear weapons. Strauss was very shrewd in manipulating the information, much of it highly classified, that went to the president. He shielded Eisenhower from receiving contrary opinions. Strauss even asked the FBI to investigate possible communist ties of any scientist who maintained that atmospheric nuclear testing was actually hazardous to one's health, and that a nuclear arms control agreement would be advantageous to the United States. Strauss's bureaucratic maneuvering was reinforced by the powerful technical expertise of scientists affiliated with the nation's nuclear weapons labs. And these include scientists such as Edward Teller and Ernest Lawrence. Here we see Edward Teller, known as the father of the H-bomb. He appeared in the movie Oppenheimer, often brooding in the background of several scenes, disappointed that Oppenheimer didn't try to move directly towards developing the hydrogen bomb, and was set aside in favor of Hans Bethe to lead one of the key divisions at Los Alamos. Some have speculated that it was Teller who served as the inspiration for another classic Hollywood film, Dr. Strangelove. And so Teller had constantly pleaded for additional nuclear tests. After the Soviet Union launched Sputnik into orbit, Eisenhower was furious that Teller told a televised audience that the U.S. had just lost a battle more important and greater than Pearl Harbor. So we have Eisenhower's response on a slide here. That Eisenhower privately behind the scenes is saying that scientists like Teller were trying to run the policy of the government. Okay? So this in many ways is a violation of the trust of advisors within Eisenhower's administration, that they are going public with disagreements about the administration. And so this is something that deeply concerned Eisenhower, is scientists moving into the eras of policy advisors and focusing on national security. And so behind the scenes and often in public when they didn't get their way, Strauss and Teller constantly advocated for additional nuclear testing, despite the growing international criticism over the health hazards of radiation that emerged from nuclear tests. Now, when tests occurred, they often irradiated the soil. The soil rose up into the atmosphere, was carried up and picked up into the jet stream. And then you had the transformation of debris into radioactive strontium-90. That when nuclear tests were conducted in Nevada, began to detect high doses or cases of strontium-90 in milk supplies emerging from Wisconsin, in wheat coming from Minnesota. And we now know that this resulted in increased cases of thyroid cancer and other health hazards. At the time, those conclusions were hotly contested. And in many cases, some physicians and scientists who made those arguments were the targets of FBI investigations to see if they were dupes of communist espionage. So the opposition to testing nuclear weapons really was much greater abroad than within the United States. Americans didn't question what their government was telling them about the safety of testing nuclear weapons within the United States. Instead, a lot of the international concerns emerged in the Pacific, where the United States held most of its initial nuclear tests. They emerged in nations that were nearby in the fallout zone or had fishermen who were caught in radioactive ash, then extended to leading international figures ranging from the Pope to members of neutral nations such as Nehru in India, and to humanitarians such as Dr. Albert Schweitzer. Well, despite these emerging concerns, Edward Teller continuously sought Eisenhower's approval, not only for weapons testing, but for what he called clean bombs. These were those that had lower doses of radiation that he thought could be used for peaceful purposes. A clean nuclear bomb, for example, could be used for mining, or it could be used to create artificial harbors. And so when scientists came to Eisenhower in the mid-1950s, a pivotal meeting in 1957, they told Eisenhower that he would be committing a crime against humanity if he did not continue nuclear testing in the atmosphere, and that this would deny society such peaceful applications of the atom. Well, this leads to Eisenhower raising several private comments in secretly held meetings, which expresses his misgivings about what his government science advisors are telling him and how they are influencing him. If you can imagine Eisenhower, the great general of the Second World War, who holds his military expertise and judgment above all else, yet in the nuclear age, he's reliant upon the highly technical advice of very secretive matters to dictate his national security strategy. This incredibly frustrated Eisenhower. And so you see these in private comments throughout this period. Eisenhower replied to Lawrence and Teller that world opinion was so strongly against atmospheric testing that the US could not permit itself to be crucified on a cross of atoms by continuing to test nuclear weapons. Crucified on a cross of atoms. It's a powerful and arresting statement. And I think you can imagine that Eisenhower, who grew up in Abilene, had to memorize the key line, crucified on a cross of gold, from one of the most famous addresses in American political history, and that's William Jennings Bryan's 1896 speech at the Democratic National Convention. That was really responsible for him winning the nomination at that time. It's a speech that school children across America would learn and memorize along with Lincoln's Gettysburg Address. So Eisenhower channeled this comment and acknowledged that there were international concerns, even though his own advisors were divided over the cost and the consequences of testing. And so there's other responses here, and it shows how Eisenhower increasingly grew troubled by the disconnect between his desire to slow the arms race and the insistence of his nuclear advisors to continue to test and build the nation's nuclear arsenal. Eisenhower had an inclination to ban tests, but he lacked the confidence in his technical expertise in the nuclear age to overrule the opposition of Strauss and Teller, who once again continuously told him that nuclear testing was not hazardous to Americans' health, and that a test ban could never be adequately monitored. And as a result, the Soviet Union would cheat on any agreement, and they would gain strategic superiority over the United States. And so throughout the early to mid part of his administration, Eisenhower continued to hesitantly approve additional tests, but he grumbled that they contradicted his publicly stated and privately held desire to slow the arms race. On various occasions, Eisenhower privately lamented, and a few other key quotes from that slide, that his statecraft had become a prisoner of our scientists. His statecraft had become a prisoner of our scientists. And he finally declared that he had had enough of public policy making by scientists. We can pause a little bit and consider that. Enough of public policy making by scientists. This private comment in 1957 sounds awfully similar to the second warning in his farewell address. Public policy could become captive of a scientific technological elite. So, in my view, Eisenhower's public policy on nuclear testing remained the captive of Teller and Strauss, the scientific technological elite within his administration, until a new committee of science advisors were formed following the shock of Sputnik. And this brought in many of the nation's top scientists who were not affiliated with the nation's nuclear weapons labs. These included many who had participated in the Manhattan Project, but that may have had some misgivings about the move to the hydrogen bomb. And so those opinions in many ways differed from the monopolized scientific advice Eisenhower was getting from Strauss and Teller. And so these new science advisors convinced Eisenhower that a ban on nuclear testing would spare the world the hazards from harmful radiation, that it would freeze the US lead in nuclear weapons superiority, and that it would provide an important first step toward greater arms control measures. Well, Eisenhower agreed with their proposals. He unilaterally banned atmospheric nuclear testing from April of 1958 until the end of his presidency, sparing the world the hazards produced by nuclear weapons tests. In addition, he initiated negotiations toward a permanent ban. And after years of technical studies and improvements in the seismic detection of possible clandestine underground testing, the nuclear powers appeared to be on the verge of an agreement to ban testing. On the eve of that pivotal summit scheduled for Paris in May of 1960, British Prime Minister Harold Macmillan predicted that the omens are good for reaching the world's first nuclear arms control agreement. Of course, we know what happened in May of 1960 to scuttle that summit. Francis Gary Powers' U-2 was shot down over the Soviet Union. The administration launched a false cover story and was caught lying. Eisenhower refused to apologize, and Khrushchev stormed out of the summit. So the U-2 incident it really caused a great deal of disappointment in Eisenhower. When he returned from that planned summit, he was discouraged and depressed. He commented to his science advisor, George Kistiakowsky, that the U-2 incident had ruined all of his efforts to make progress on easing tensions. According to Kistiakowsky, Eisenhower sadly commented that he saw nothing worthwhile left for him to do until the end of his presidency. Of course, we know that Kennedy resumed nuclear test ban negotiations following the Cuban Missile Crisis, resulting in the ratification of the Limited Nuclear Test Ban Treaty of 1963, a treaty that prohibited the testing of nuclear weapons above ground, underwater, and in outer space. This was the first nuclear arms control agreement, and some have hailed it as the first victory for the global environmental movement. And so last year, on the 60th anniversary of the signing of the treaty, few commented that this first nuclear arms control treaty is a central part of Eisenhower's legacy of waging peace. Convinced of the hazards of atmospheric testing, Eisenhower firmly rejected the constant appeals of the AEC and the Defense Department to resume testing and end the negotiations that ultimately succeeded in the Atmospheric Test Ban Treaty. And so as we consider Eisenhower's lessons and record in waging peace and some of the lessons that may apply to the 21st century, this episode offers a lesson on the perils of determining public policy on controversial technical matters on a narrow range of scientific expertise. Without a science advisor determined to serve as an honest broker and an advisory body comprised of non-governmental scientists, future administrations may be susceptible to becoming, like Eisenhower for much of his presidency, the captive of a scientific technological elite. Thank you very much. I look forward to your comments and questions on the curiously yeasty nature of Eisenhower's farewell address.
No questions in the room? Okay, oh, we do have one, okay.
Hi, I'm Nicole Beck. I just, it's not a question, I just wanted to compliment you on the interesting talk and all of the research that you put into it. It was really informative.
Thank you so much. I appreciate it.
Thank you. I do want to say if there's anyone who's listening to us virtually, if you have questions, you can put it in the chat. I'm happy to ask them for you. Oh, there is a question. Not sure if you can see that question. It says, based on these historical contexts, how should Eisenhower's first warning be interpreted today? It's clear that regardless of original intent, the comments have found themselves powerful in the cultural zeitgeist. Does that make revision futile? Futile, if not, why? Thank you. I hope you heard all of that, or can we see it?
Well, thank you for the question from Mr. Fleece here. Historical context, how should we interpret it today? You know, I think to rephrase that question, how is it interpreted today? Really, the lesson from all of this is the warning is vague enough that it can be interpreted and used and reused in many different ways. And so if it's about excessive military spending, that's appropriate. The revolving door of high-ranking military into corporate America. A few restrictions on that of 6-month waiting periods and things of that nature. I think the way that the warning has been misused is to the extreme to suggest that the military-industrial complex has purposefully sought war. I think in Eisenhower's view, he actually answers this in one of his letter writers in the mid-1960s, where he emphasizes that he doesn't think that anyone is actually wanting war. It's that they're wanting to spend more than necessary. And so I think that's an important corrective to keep in mind on what he was warning about, because he talks about the unwarranted influence. Okay, so that suggests that there is warranted influence of the military-industrial complex. And so that's why it's so tricky to interpret, because as you read the documents about his frustrations, he honestly believes that he is the only one in the United States that could stand up to the military-industrial complex because of his experience in World War II. And he doesn't think Kennedy can do it. He doesn't think Nixon can do it. He doesn't think Johnson can do it. He even mistrusts some of his former subordinates that are now in the high ranks of the organization of the military. So it really is a curious warning, because there's a line in here about only an alert and knowledgeable citizenry can prevent the unwarranted influence. But in reality, I think Eisenhower thinks that only Eisenhower can prevent the unwarranted influence. And so it's an interesting dynamic that there's some tensions within the speech, and absolutely some tensions within Eisenhower's own mind about what the problem is and what the possible solutions are. And Eisenhower, I think you see that he becomes actually more hawkish once he leaves the White House than he was within. And I think that's interesting as well. I think that's more of a commentary of he really did not think much of Kennedy or Johnson, even though both of them at sometimes sought Eisenhower's advice. In fact, Kennedy was very much eager to get Eisenhower's endorsement to ratify the test ban treaty. And you have the same actors in the administration come out where Strauss and Teller are traveling to Gettysburg and convincing Eisenhower, don't support this treaty. And other scientists are going to Gettysburg and telling him, Eisenhower, you really need to support this treaty. And so it's fascinating how those internal political battles continue to play out even after Eisenhower departs the Oval Office.
Okay, we do have a question in the room.
Hello, my name is Delmar Murphy, and my question is, how much did Congress fight Eisenhower in trying to stop the military-industrial complex? Were there individuals in Congress that really wanted the industrial complex and the field bases because it would have been good for the employment and economic boom in their districts? And was Strong a lobbyist, undercover lobbyist for the military industrial complex?
Well, I think there's a couple of strands here. One is those who would channel the military industrial complex weren't really discussing the need of a peacetime industrial base. What they were championing are what we would call today instances of fraud, waste, and abuse. And so, we heard in the 1980s about the Air Force paying for $2,000 toilet seats for some of their aircraft and things of that nature. So the way that Congress plays a role in this is to look at wasteful spending and the contracting process, but less so are those who are saying, why is it that for almost every budget, Congress approves a higher defense budget than every administration calls for? And that's historically true across party affiliations within administrations. And so the corporate entities in many ways have been incredibly savvy about breaking down the various components of their most complicated weapon systems and making sure that their components are manufactured in many different congressional districts. And so that in many ways protects spending or tries to increase spending on those weapon systems elsewhere. In fact, former Secretary of Defense Robert Gates had an op-ed just a couple of days ago that was really commenting upon this continued problem. So that very much is a continuous problem. And the role of Congress has been less about addressing the challenge of advocating for systems that are less needed or are asked for within Congress. And Congress's role has often been to look at what they see as wasteful defense spending, or fraud, waste, and abuse as kind of the holy trinity of congressional investigations on the military contracting process.
All right, are there any other questions?
My name is Troy Elkins. I was just wondering, how was Eisenhower's farewell address received in NATO countries and allied countries at the time?
Yeah, that's a fascinating question. I must admit I haven't examined that. I don't know the answer to that question, but it's a fascinating one. It's one we should look into. I think that there's some broader debates about the U.S. role, and I think, as I think through how the Kennedy administration plays out and the actions with reinforcing Berlin with the wall crisis and other aspects, there is a tendency on some, especially France, to really move forward with their own nuclear weapons programs and their own arsenal. And so in some ways you see a shift from the Eisenhower to the Kennedy administration, whereas Eisenhower had sought to perhaps minimize America's ground troop footprint in Europe, you begin to see that Europe is rebuilt to some extent during the crisis. So it's hard to give a general answer when countries in Europe are taking different approaches to rearmament at that time.
Thank you. I don't see any other questions in the room, and I don't see any online. So I would say thank you so much, Dr. Greene, for a wonderful presentation. I certainly appreciate it. We certainly appreciate it.
Thank you so much. Thank you, Joy. Thank you so much.
You're welcome. And just a few housekeeping things before we leave. First of all, there are surveys on the table. If you could fill those out for me, that really helps me. I certainly appreciate it. Again, thank you all for joining us, including the virtual audience. We invite you back next month on the 24th for our final lunch and learn of the year. We will welcome Dr. Sarah Roby of Idaho State University, and she will speak to us about President Eisenhower's Atoms for Peace speech. As always, you can find more information about our programs on our website, eisenhowerlibrary.gov, where you can also join our mailing list. Thank you again so much, and have a wonderful afternoon.
Well,
The guest speaker.